The intelligence report arrived at the Wolf's Lair on the morning of May 23, 1944, a single sheet of paper stamped with the highest security classification, containing numbers that should have been impossible. Fremde Heere West, the Wehrmacht intelligence section monitoring the Western Allies, had compiled their latest assessment of American troop strength in Britain. The conclusion was stark: 8 million men, not the 2 million German planners had estimated, not the 3 million they had grudgingly revised upward. 8 million American soldiers had been mobilized, and a massive portion of that force was now concentrated in southern England, preparing for an invasion that could come at any moment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Adolf Hitler read the report 3 times. Then he summoned his generals. What followed in that conference room was not the rage his staff had come to expect, but something more unsettling. A silence that stretched for minutes as Hitler stared at maps showing the concentration of Allied forces across the Channel. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet, almost confused. Where did they all come from? It was a question that revealed the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of German strategy, a miscalculation that would cost Hitler everything. The story begins 2.5 years earlier, in December 1941, when Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States. At that moment, American military strength was modest, roughly 1,600,000 men under arms, many of them poorly trained, inadequately equipped, scattered across a nation still clinging to peacetime thinking. German intelligence had assessed this force with professional thoroughness and reached a comfortable conclusion. America might eventually field an army of 2 million, perhaps 2.5 million, at absolute maximum. Those troops would require years of training. Their industrial base, while large, was oriented towards civilian production. Their officer corps was thin. Their doctrine was untested. By the time America could meaningfully contribute to the war in Europe, the war would be over. Hitler believed this assessment completely. It aligned with everything he thought he knew about America. A mongrel nation, he called it, weakened by racial mixing, corrupted by Jewish influence, softened by democracy and capitalism. Such a nation could not suddenly transform itself into a military power capable of challenging the Third Reich. The very idea was absurd. Germany had been preparing for war for a decade. Its people had been hardened by discipline and sacrifice. Its military tradition stretched back centuries. What could Americans, who had spent the 1930s watching movies and buying automobiles, possibly know about total war? The first intelligence reports that suggested something unexpected was happening came in spring 1942. American troop strength had reached 2 million men, 6 months ahead of German projections. Training camps were expanding at a rate that seemed impossible. Production figures for tanks, aircraft, and ships were climbing beyond anything German analysts had thought achievable. But the reports also noted significant problems. The Americans were making mistakes, struggling with logistics, dealing with equipment shortages. Their rapid expansion was causing chaos. Quality was suffering in the rush for quantity. German intelligence officers in Fremde Heere West compiled these reports with growing unease, but their conclusions remained cautiously optimistic. Yes, America was mobilizing faster than expected, but the force being created was bloated, inefficient, poorly coordinated. A paper tiger, impressive in numbers, but lacking the discipline and combat effectiveness that only years of military tradition could provide. Hitler read these assessments and found them reassuring. Let the Americans build their oversized army. When that army met the Wehrmacht in battle, numbers would not save them. But the numbers kept growing in ways that defied every assumption German planners had made. By summer 1942, American forces exceeded 3 million. By autumn, 3.5 million. The machinery of American mobilization was not slowing down, it was accelerating. Training camps that had been built to hold 10,000 men were expanded to hold 50,000. Factories that had been producing civilian goods were converted to military production almost overnight. The entire American economy was being reorganized with a speed and efficiency that seemed incompatible with democracy. In Berlin, analysts struggled to explain what they were seeing. Democratic nations were not supposed to be capable of this kind of total mobilization. That was supposed to be the advantage of authoritarian systems like the Third Reich, the ability to command resources, to direct labor, to subordinate individual desires to the needs of the state. Yet, somehow, America was mobilizing more thoroughly than Germany had, and doing it while maintaining democratic institutions, free press, and civilian control of the military. The German explanation, repeated in intelligence assessments and Hitler's conferences with his generals, was that American mobilization was hollow. Yes, they were inducting millions of men, but those men were not becoming real soldiers. They were being given uniforms and basic training and then counted as combat effective when they were nothing of the sort. The true test would come when these paper divisions faced the Wehrmacht in actual combat. That test came in November 1942 with Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. For the first time, American ground forces engaged German troops in sustained combat. The results seemed to confirm German assumptions. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inflicted a severe defeat on American troops. 2,000 casualties, 100 tanks destroyed, entire positions overrun. American soldiers, confronted with the reality of combat against experienced German veterans, had broken. Hitler seized on Kasserine Pass as vindication. You see, he told his inner circle, they cannot fight. All their production, all their numbers, and they run when they meet real soldiers. The American army is exactly what I said it would be. Large, wealthy, and fundamentally weak. But Rommel, commanding the forces that had won at Kasserine, and sent a very different assessment to Berlin. Yes, the Americans had fought poorly initially, but they had learned with frightening speed. Within weeks, they had adjusted their tactics, reorganized their command structure, and come back harder. And behind them was something Rommel found more disturbing than their improving combat effectiveness, an endless stream of replacements and equipment. The Germans could win battles, but the Americans could afford to lose them. They would learn from their losses, adapt, and return with more men and more material than before. Hitler dismissed Rommel's warnings as defeatism. The field marshal had grown pessimistic, infected by the despair of fighting a losing campaign in North Africa. What mattered was not Rommel's concerns, but the objective facts. And the objective facts, as German intelligence understood them in early 1943, were that America had mobilized approximately 4 million men. This was higher than initial German estimates, certainly, but still within the range of what a nation of America's size could reasonably manage. The quality of those troops remained questionable. Their combat performance in North Africa had been poor. Yes, they were learning, but learning took time. And time was something the Allies did not have, because while America was slowly building its army, Germany was winning the war, or so it seemed from Berlin in early 1943. The Eastern Front had stabilized after the disaster at Stalingrad. New offensives were being planned. Atlantic U-boats were still sinking Allied shipping at an alarming rate. The German war economy, under Albert Speer's direction, was reaching new levels of production. If Germany could hold its positions for another year, could bleed the Soviets white in the East and keep the Western Allies bottled up in North Africa and Italy, then negotiations might be possible. A compromise peace that would leave Germany dominant in Europe. This strategic calculation depended entirely on one assumption, that the Western Allies, and particularly the Americans, could not build and deploy a force large enough to mount a successful invasion of France before Germany had time to consolidate its position. And that assumption depended on German intelligence estimates of American mobilization capacity. Those estimates were wrong. Catastrophically, world historically wrong. By summer 1943, American forces exceeded 6 million men. By autumn, 7 million. The reports reaching Berlin no longer spoke of a bloated, inefficient mobilization. They spoke of something unprecedented in military history. America was creating multiple armies, each larger than Germany's entire pre-war force, and doing it while simultaneously fighting a major campaign in the Pacific against Japan. The scale of it defied comprehension. New divisions were being formed every month. Training had become systematized, efficient, producing soldiers who, while perhaps not equal to German veterans in experience, were increasingly competent in the basics of modern warfare. Equipment was flowing from American factories in quantities that made German production look inadequate. Sherman tanks, inferior to German panzers, in direct combat, but produced in numbers that overwhelmed that qualitative advantage. B-17 and B-24 bombers filling the skies over Europe in formations that German fighters could not stop. Liberty ships, being launched faster than U-boats, could sink them, carrying an endless stream of supplies across the Atlantic. And still the men kept coming. Every month, another 100,000 inducted, another 200,000. The training camps could barely keep pace. Neither could German intelligence. By late 1943, Fremde Heere West was producing estimates that even they found difficult to believe. American military strength was approaching 8 million men. 8 million. It was a number that belonged to Soviet mobilization, to the desperate total war of the Eastern Front, not to a democratic capitalist nation an ocean away from the fighting. Hitler received the revised estimates with visible anger. He accused his intelligence officers of being deceived by Allied propaganda, of accepting inflated numbers designed to demoralize Germany. The Americans could not possibly have 8 million men under arms, even if they had inducted that many men. Those men could not all be real soldiers. Most of them had to be support troops, logistics personnel, men in training who would never see combat. The actual number of combat-effective American troops had to be far lower, but the intelligence officers stood by their assessment. They had multiple sources: aerial reconnaissance showing the massive build-up in Britain, signals intelligence intercepting American communications, reports from agents in neutral countries, the mathematical analysis of American industrial production and shipping capacity. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. America had mobilized a force beyond anything German planners had thought possible, and that force was now concentrating in southern England. The implications were devastating. If America had truly fielded 8 million men, and if a significant portion of that force was preparing to invade France, then Germany faced a strategic nightmare. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's system of coastal fortifications, had been designed to repel an invasion force of perhaps 1 million men, maybe 2 million at most. The defenders would be outnumbered, but the advantages of defensive positions, combined with the difficulty of amphibious operations, would allow German forces to throw the invaders back into the sea. But if the Allies came with 3 million men, 4 million, 5 million, with unlimited supplies and air superiority, and the willingness to take heavy casualties, then the Atlantic Wall might not hold. And if the Atlantic Wall did not hold, if the Allies established a successful beachhead in France, then Germany would be fighting a two-front war against enemies who could outproduce and outnumber them in every category. This was the reality that intelligence report in May 1944 was forcing Hitler to confront. 8 million American troops, not 2 million, not the manageable force German strategy had been designed to contain. 8 million men, backed by industrial production that exceeded Germany's capacity by orders of magnitude, preparing for an invasion that could come at any moment. Hitler's question in that conference room, where did they all come from, was not merely rhetorical. It reflected a genuine incomprehension. His entire worldview had insisted that what America had done was impossible. Weak democracies did not mobilize more effectively than strong authoritarian states. Mongrel nations did not outproduce racially pure ones. Comfortable, individualistic peoples did not suddenly develop the discipline and coordination necessary for total war. Yet, the evidence was undeniable. America had done exactly what Hitler had said could not be done. And now, in late spring 1944, the consequences of that miscalculation were gathering across the English Channel, like a storm Hitler could see coming, but could no longer prevent. The German military had built its strategy on assumptions that now lay in ruins. Every calculation about the timing of an invasion, about the forces Germany would need to repel it, about how long the war could be sustained on multiple fronts, all of it had been based on the belief that America could field perhaps 2 million combat troops in Europe by mid-1944. That was the number that had shaped German defensive planning. That was the number that made the Atlantic Wall seem adequate. That was the number that made holding France appear possible. But 2 million had become 8 million, and nobody in the German High Command could explain how it had happened so quickly. The answer lay in something the Germans had fundamentally misunderstood about American society. They had looked at American democracy, its diversity, its individualism, and seen weakness. What they had failed to grasp was that those same characteristics, when mobilized towards a common purpose, created a flexibility and efficiency that authoritarian systems could not match. American factories could retool from civilian to military production in months because they were managed by industrialists who understood production efficiency, not by party officials enforcing ideological purity. American workers could be rapidly trained because the education system had created a population with basic literacy and mechanical aptitude. American logistics could handle the complexity of deploying millions of men overseas because the country had spent decades building a continental economy that required sophisticated supply chains. Germany had built a war machine. America had transformed itself into one. And the scale of that transformation was only now becoming fully apparent. In early June 1944, as German defenders along the French coast prepared for an invasion they knew was imminent, the final intelligence assessments painted a picture of overwhelming Allied superiority. 8 million American troops mobilized, 2.5 million already in Britain or in the Mediterranean theater, another million in the Pacific fighting Japan. The rest in training or in transit. Behind them, an industrial base producing 40% of all Allied military equipment, a navy that had achieved supremacy in both oceans, an air force that was systematically destroying German industrial capacity. The numbers were so large they became almost abstract. Individual German soldiers preparing defensive positions along the Atlantic Wall could not really comprehend what 8 million meant. They knew the Allies would have numerical superiority. That was expected. But 8 million. It was beyond their experience, beyond their frame of reference. Hitler's generals tried to explain the strategic implications. With such overwhelming force, the Allies could afford to lose entire divisions and simply replace them. They could attack simultaneously at multiple points, forcing Germany to spread its defenders impossibly thin. They could sustain operations indefinitely, grinding through German defenses with the patient application of superior resources. The Eastern Front had taught German commanders what warfare against a numerically superior enemy looked like. Now, they were going to experience it in the West as well. Hitler's response was to retreat into fantasy. He spoke of secret weapons that would turn the tide, of jet aircraft that would sweep Allied bombers from the sky, of V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets that would devastate British cities and break Allied morale, of new U-boats with schnorkel systems that would once again dominate the Atlantic, of political divisions within the Allied coalition that would cause it to fracture. Anything to avoid confronting the central truth that he had declared war on a nation whose capacity for mobilization he had completely failed to understand, and that miscalculation was now going to cost Germany the war. June 6th, 1944. Operation Overlord. The invasion came at Normandy, not at the Pas de Calais where Hitler had expected it. In the first 24 hours, 156,000 Allied troops came ashore. Within a week, 326,000. Within a month, 1 million men had landed in France. along with 566,000 tons of supplies and 171,000 vehicles. The scale of the logistics was something Germany simply could not match. The Allies had built artificial harbors, the Mulberry harbors, and towed them across the Channel to create instant port facilities. They had laid fuel pipelines under the sea. They had organized a supply chain that could sustain multiple armies in continuous combat, while simultaneously building up forces for future operations. This was not just military strength, it was industrial and organizational capacity operating at a level Germany had never achieved even at the height of its power. Hitler's initial reaction to the Normandy landings was defiant. The Atlantic Wall would hold. The Allies would be pushed back into the sea. German counterattacks would destroy the beachheads. He ordered his generals to fight for every meter of ground, to throw the Allies back through sheer will and determination. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But the orders made no difference. The men who might have executed those orders effectively were dead on the Eastern Front or trapped in defensive positions without fuel or ammunition. The tanks that might have driven the Allies back had been destroyed by Allied air power before they could reach the battlefield. The reinforcements that might have turned the tide did not exist. Germany had committed everything to holding the East and now had nothing left to stop the West. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the end of June, the Allies had 1 million men in Normandy. By the end of July, 2 million. By the end of August, 3 million troops had passed through the beachheads, and they were breaking out across France at a pace that stunned even Allied commanders. Towns and cities that Germany had occupied for 4 years were liberated in days. German defenders, who had been told to hold to the last man, were surrendering in thousands. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered France in 6 weeks in 1940, was now being driven out in 3 months by the very force Hitler had said could never exist. The reports reaching Hitler's headquarters grew more desperate each day. Entire divisions destroyed, supply lines cut, communications severed, commanders requesting permission to retreat, being told to stand and die. It was the Eastern Front again, but compressed into a smaller space and happening faster. And behind the advancing Allied forces, more Americans kept coming, fresh divisions, replacement troops, new equipment. The 8 million were not an abstract number anymore. They were a physical reality, crushing everything in their path. Hitler's staff noticed a change in him after Normandy. The certainty was gone. The angry dismissals of bad news gave way to long silences. He spent hours studying maps as if he could find some tactical solution to a strategic catastrophe. He issued orders for counterattacks that everyone knew were impossible. He blamed his generals for lacking will, for not understanding that determination could overcome material disadvantage. But privately, in moments witnessed by his secretaries and close staff, he returned obsessively to the same question. Where did they all come from? How had the Americans done it? Not just the number of men, though that was incomprehensible enough, but the organization, the logistics, the coordination. Germany had been preparing for total war since the Nazis took power in 1933. 11 years of preparation. America had mobilized in less than 3 years and had surpassed everything Germany had achieved. The answer, which Hitler could never fully accept, was that his entire understanding of what made nations strong had been wrong. He had believed that authoritarian control created efficiency, that racial purity created strength, that military tradition created superior soldiers, that propaganda and ideology could substitute for material resources. Every one of those beliefs was being disproven by the American army tearing through France. The Americans were not racially pure. Their units included men whose grandparents had come from dozens of countries, who spoke different languages at home, who practiced different religions. By Hitler's theories, such a force should have been weak, divided, unable to fight cohesively. Instead, they fought with remarkable coordination, supporting each other, adapting to circumstances, showing exactly the kind of unit cohesion Hitler claimed only pure Germanic peoples could achieve. The Americans were not ideologically indoctrinated. They had not spent years in Hitler Youth or labor service learning to subordinate themselves to the state. Most of them had been civilians 2 or 3 years earlier, and they remained fundamentally civilian in their attitudes. They questioned orders when they seemed stupid. They improvised solutions rather than following doctrine. They treated their officers with casual familiarity that would have resulted in court-martial in the Wehrmacht. Yet, somehow, this unmilitary attitude produced soldiers who were increasingly effective in combat. The Americans were not products of ancient military tradition. Their army had been tiny before the war. Most of their officers had learned their trade in the last 3 years. Their doctrine was borrowed from Britain and France, modified through experience, constantly evolving. They made mistakes constantly, learned from them quickly, and adapted faster than the Germans could counter. There was nothing elegant about American military operations. They were often crude, reliant on overwhelming force rather than tactical sophistication. But they worked, and they kept working because behind every operation was an inexhaustible reserve of men and material. By autumn 1944, the strategic situation was hopeless. In the West, Allied forces had liberated France and Belgium and were approaching the German border. In the East, Soviet forces had destroyed Army Group Center and were driving into Poland. In Italy, Allied armies were pushing north. In the air, German cities were being systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. In the Atlantic, U-boats were being hunted to extinction. On every front, in every theater, Germany was losing. And still, Hitler could not accept that the war was lost. In December 1944, he launched one final offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. German forces achieved surprise, drove deep into American positions, created panic in Allied headquarters. Hitler seized on the initial success as proof that the Americans were still weak, still vulnerable to determined attack. But the offensive failed. Not because of any great tactical failure by German forces, but because of something simpler. The Americans had too many men, too much equipment, too many reserves. Every German division committed to the offensive was irreplaceable. Every American division that was stopped was simply reinforced. The Germans advanced until they ran out of fuel and ammunition. The Americans fell back, regrouped, and counterattacked. Within a month, the offensive had collapsed, and Germany had lost the last mobile reserves that might have defended the homeland. Hitler's reaction to the failure of the Bulge offensive was documented by Albert Speer, who visited him in early January 1945. Hitler seemed to have aged years in months. He trembled constantly. His left arm hung useless. He shuffled rather than walked, and he spoke obsessively about betrayal. The offensive had failed because his generals had lacked will, because the troops had not fought hard enough, because fate had turned against Germany. Never because the Americans had 8 million men and Germany had nothing left to stop them. The final months were a slow collapse. By March 1945, American forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving into the heart of Germany. Behind them came more Americans, and more, an endless stream of troops and equipment moving east. German commanders who had spent years fighting the Soviets said the Americans were different. The Soviets attacked with masses of men and accepted staggering casualties. The Americans attacked with masses of men, but also with careful coordination, overwhelming firepower, and sophisticated logistics. You could stop a Soviet attack by making it too costly. You could not stop an American attack because they simply adjusted and came at you from a different direction with fresh forces. By April, American and Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from opposite directions. The 8 million had come. They had fought across France, through Belgium, over the Rhine, into Germany itself. They had done everything Hitler said they could not do. And in a bunker, beneath the ruins of Berlin, Hitler finally ran out of delusions. His last recorded comments about the Americans came in late April 1945, witnessed by several staff members. He was not raging anymore. The anger had burned out, leaving something hollow behind. "They did it," he said quietly. "The Americans did what I said was impossible. They built an army larger than any in history, equipped it better than any force has ever been equipped, and used it to destroy everything I built. I did not believe they could. I was certain they could not. I was wrong about everything." It was the closest Hitler ever came to admitting the truth, that his declaration of war on America had been the greatest strategic mistake of his career, that his assumptions about American weakness had been completely false, that the 8 million men who were now occupying Germany were not an accident or a miracle, but the logical result of mobilizing a nation whose industrial and organizational capacity he had never understood. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. 8 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war he had expanded by declaring on America with such contempt was over. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had lasted 12, and the army of 8 million men he had insisted could never exist stood victorious across Europe, having helped destroy the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. The numbers tell their own story. In December 1941, when Hitler declared war on America, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world, smaller than Romania's. By May 1945, it was the largest, best equipped, most powerful military force in human history. Germany, by contrast, began the war with the world's most feared army and ended it with that army shattered, its cities in ruins, its nation occupied and divided. But the numbers alone do not capture what happened. What happened was the complete repudiation of everything Hitler believed about power, about strength, about what made nations capable of total war. He had built his entire worldview on the assumption that authoritarian control, racial purity, and military tradition were the foundations of national strength. America disproved every one of those assumptions. A diverse, democratic nation had accomplished what Hitler insisted only a pure authoritarian state could achieve, and had done so faster, more efficiently, and more thoroughly than Germany ever managed. The 8 million men were not just soldiers. They were evidence. Every one of them was proof that Hitler's theories were wrong, his assumptions false, his certainty misplaced. He had looked at America and seen weakness. America had looked back and shown him strength beyond his comprehension. The mongrel nation had outfought the master race. The soft democracy had outproduced the efficient dictatorship. The unmilitary people had created the most effective military force in the world. This was the real meaning of the question Hitler asked in May 1944. Where did they all come from? They came from a nation he had completely failed to understand, from an economic system he had dismissed as weak, from a social structure he had considered inferior, from values he had mocked as decadent. They came from everything Hitler insisted made nations vulnerable, and they destroyed everything he insisted made nations strong. In the end, the story of the 8 million is not really about numbers. It is about the catastrophic consequences of building a worldview on false assumptions. Hitler assumed democracy was weak, so he declared war on the world's most powerful democracy. He assumed industrial capitalism was inefficient, so he challenged the world's most productive economy. He assumed diversity was a weakness, so he fought a nation whose diversity was a source of strength. Every assumption was wrong. Every calculation was false. And 8 million men, their equipment, their supplies, their unstoppable advance across Europe, proved just how wrong those assumptions had been. Hitler learned what those 8 million meant. He learned it in intelligence reports that kept revising upward. He learned it in battles lost despite every effort to win them. He learned it in the steady, inexorable advance of armies he had insisted could never exist. He learned it too late to matter, too late to change course, too late to do anything but watch as the consequences of his miscalculation destroyed everything he had built. That was his final answer to America's 8 million troops. Not words, but silence. The silence of a man who had run out of delusions, out of justifications, out of time. The silence of absolute defeat. The 8 million had come, not the 2 million he expected, and they had proven, in the most final way possible, that everything Adolf Hitler believed about strength, about power, about the nature of nations and peoples was nothing more than the fantasy of a man who had mistaken his prejudices for insight and his contempt for wisdom. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.